I'm going to get started, and I will introduce myself. I'm Kathleen Moore, but I am really happy to say, although I would welcome others, that I think everybody on here knows me, and I know you and remember you well, and I'm so glad to see each one of you. I was the seminarian at St. John's for 2 years, which was, I just really lucked out. And right now I am in southwestern Vermont, where I am a transitional deacon. My ordination to the priesthood has been put off a little bit because of COVID, but it will happen. So yeah, I'm here, and we actually do have a little traffic here too, because we have lots of people joining us from New York City and Boston, living with us in Vermont this time, which has been very interesting. And yeah, and one of the, some of you will have heard some of this, because during the last general convention in 2018, following that, I was appointed to this task force on liturgical and prayer book revision. And I'll talk a little bit about what that may mean, because it's still a little bit unclear. But one of the things that I know it means is that I have spent a lot of time thinking about our liturgy and about our prayer book that we use as Episcopalians. So I just wanted to get started this evening, especially since it's such a small group, by asking a little question, which you can answer in the chat box or by unmuting yourself, however you want to answer it, which is that when you think of the Book of Common Prayer, what words come to mind? What feelings come to mind? What do you associate with it?
Well, after today, Scott will get my reference, but it was written before the internet.
Say more about that.
We're dealing with the fact that we think you should be able to do virtual consecration, but the church says no. And our bishop specifically said, well, the prayer book doesn't have any provisions with it. And I responded to Scott and said, well, the prayer book was written before the internet.
What an interesting reason not to do something, that it's not in the prayer book. So keep that in mind. That's interesting. What else?
Says what I want to say, but don't have the words to say.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Oh, it says. I got it.
There's joy in sharing it with the youth, that sense of belonging they have, that everyone in other Episcopal churches have it. Somehow they connect with it more than with the Bible, and they have ownership of it more than the Bible. So that's really fun to watch them.
That's interesting, Keller. Helen says, I think of it as a handbook or operations manual in a poetic way. It's traditional. And Susan says, there is a prayer in the book for just about anything. As a recovering Baptist, I love the fact that the beautiful prayers were put together by thoughtful people.
I'll double as a form.
Double on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One word that comes to mind for me is the word may. It's used all the time in the prayer book. You may.
Say more about why you like the word may.
You may. There's no like heavy-handedness to it. There's sort of like, you might consider this.
Yeah.
You might not.
And I think it's telling, because you hear from Episcopalians who love the may, and you hear from Episcopalians who get very frustrated by the may. So there's probably some sort of personality type thing.
At least May's already over, so.
Well, yeah, there is that kind of may too. Yeah.
There are a lot of options. So not only, one or two, but pick one of these sentences or one of these verses, or some of those prayers are ancient. And sometimes when I find out from that history, it gives me kind of shivers. I like that.
Lots of thumbs up to that.
And some of those prayers bring tears to my eyes every time.
Yeah.
The committal in a funeral, the Good Friday collect, just wonderful.
Anyone else before I move along? Okay, you'll still have chances, but I like to start with that because I think that even just those answers reveal that there's a reason when we start to talk about the prayer book, and especially when we try to start talking about tinkering with the prayer book, that it can become really charged really fast. And it's because it means so much to almost all of us, but it means different things in different ways. It's meaningful for different reasons. And so therefore, this thing that just carries so much in it can be hard to talk about when we're thinking about change. So I'm gonna share my screen here. Can y'all see that? It's not that exciting. So the idea of the prayer book, when I think about sort of, you all were so good at mentioning so many of the things that it means to us. And I kind of break it down into these three main buckets. And this is for me, this is the way I've started to think about it, which is that, first of all, I don't think we think about it this way often enough, but the idea of a prayer book ought to be revolutionary and it ought to be empowering. The thing about this book is that it is not just for our priests. It is not just for our deacons. It is not just for our bishops. It's for all of us, for anybody to use at home. That has always been the idea. And to the bishop's point earlier, whether you like them or not, the rubrics are right there for everybody to read. So it's not this closed thing that people don't know about. It's something that many of us have in our homes. It's something accessible for those who can read, I would point out, which we too often forget is not everyone. But theoretically, it's something that you don't have to go to seminary to be able to fully access, use, and love, and you certainly don't have to be ordained. Beyond that, you don't have to be ordained to actually use these prayers or for the offices to officiate for the daily office. So again, just the idea that there's this, that it's this liturgy that really ought to belong to all of us, still, to me, is a pretty revolutionary thing. And I have to say, one of my favorite St. John's memories was the confirm, not conform session on the Book of Common Prayer. And one of the exercises that most of you probably know about is that we told the kids to go put together their own baptism service using the book. And they were gone, Keller will know this, what do they take, like 10 minutes? And they came back and baptized Mickey Mouse in like absolutely perfectly. Like it was so funny because of course I was like taking a liturgical leadership class at the time and I was like, they did it better than some of my seminary classmates because I don't know, I think there wasn't just all this weight to it. They just read the directions and they were so easily able to see what was going on. And then when we talked about it after, it wasn't like they were just sort of parroting words, like they understood what was going on. Now these were really smart St. John's kids, and it still says something about the accessibility of this book and these liturgies and the fact that the directions themselves are even in there. So that's sort of that empowering part of it. The other part of it is this sort of, and some of y'all talked about this sort of idea of a universality about it, that, you know, this idea, which increasingly is not quite the case, but the idea that across the Episcopal Church, we're all using these very familiar, very comfortable liturgies and prayers from this one book with these same page numbers. And there's power in that. Before I made a major career change of all career changes, I was in television network scheduling. And one of the reasons I went into that field was because I loved back in the day when there were still television shows that almost the entire country watched. I loved that feeling of shared experience. And so again, like it's in that way, you can think of the Book of Common Prayer as this sort of mass shared experience across the Episcopal Church. Beyond that, the prayer book, as a product of Anglicanism around the world, also offers this sense of the universal. I have prayed with Anglicans and been to Anglican church in England, in Zambia, in Ghana, and in South Africa. And I think many of you have as well. I remember this. And one of the things that just is always so moving to me is that no matter where I have been, no matter what the church looks like, there's always something really comfortable about the feel and the shape of Anglican worship. And so while their prayer books are not the same as our prayer books, and there are important differences in different contexts, there is something about that prayer book liturgy that just has a certain feel to it and a certain comfort. And one of the reasons for that is that all of our prayer books do, as you were saying, I think it was Alan, that so many of these prayers are it draws on these really ancient texts, not only scripture, but other ancient texts. And so most prayer books across the Anglican Communion do that. And so you, again, have the shared ancient text, the shared shape of liturgy. And then also, I will argue, in every language and tradition, there's a shared love for the art of it and for the beauty of it. So again, I think even in parts of the communion that are not as focused on like reading the written word, there's still real attention to the beauty of it, the way it's said, the way it's sung. And I think that's something that's really shared. So it's this power in that universal experience. On the other hand, somehow at the exact same time, one of the most powerful things about our prayer book tradition is that it's contextual. So while we have this sort of universal, again, if you're looking either at the Anglican Communion or at the Episcopal Church, we also have these adjustments for context. And this is where you will have difference of opinion among Episcopalians. There are some who would not argue this, but I argue that at the heart of the prayer book tradition is actually a healthy respect for context and a healthy response to change in time and change in place. I think if you look at the history, just the basic history of the prayer book, again, from the very beginning, from 1549 on to the establishment of the Episcopal Church, was a response to a very, very drastic change in context, that's actually one of the most beautiful things about it, that it's this traditional universal thing, and it provides this room as we go through time and place to make adjustments. So, again, most of you know this, but just a little bit of a review. So the current prayer book we're working with, which is the only prayer book I have ever known, is the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. And it was sort of a product, as so many things were in all churches, certainly all liturgical churches, of this mid-century liturgical renewal. So a real interest in kind of looking back to all of that tradition that we're talking about, all these ancient texts. And it was not just a revision in terms of like, let's sort of update the language. It was also a real like recentering of theology. So it really centered us in this, what's called this baptismal theology. And so before 79, it was much more common to see private baptisms. They were kind of private affairs often. And then in 79, it was like, it was going to be in community. So the sacraments themselves, all sacraments, baptism and Eucharist in particular, were moved to the center of our lives together. Before 1979, I wasn't there, but I am told on good authority, Eucharist was not necessarily celebrated every single Sunday the way that it is now. I can't imagine that. I can't imagine it. And so that in and of itself, for me, tells me what a huge, enormous change it was, that I can't imagine the church I grew up in so different. and it is the same church, and the prayer book did that. I think it's a really interesting thing to think about now, because we find ourselves in a moment where, as John mentioned, normative weekly Eucharist is a question mark, how we do it, if we do it. So it's really interesting to me that there was this huge theological shift with at least weekly Eucharist at the center of it. And so it made us Episcopalians feel like it's not church without Eucharist, which is good and has led to all kinds of good things. And now we find ourselves in a situation where we feel rather lost, and one wonders if we would still feel so lost if this hadn't happened. Not saying it shouldn't have, but it's just an interesting thought exercise. There were some good folks who did some hard work leading up to this revision, who managed to get inclusive language for humanity. You don't see much mankind. You do see some. If you look at Rite One, we pray for all men. But mostly humanity language in 1979 is pretty inclusive. Although, again, as we sort of change our understanding of gendered language and the way we use it, I would argue there's probably more work to be done now. And while they did get that done, not so much for the divine. There are exceptions. There are not many. Most of the gendered language for the divine in the 1979 Book of Common Prayer is male. So now we come to the last General Convention. I promise I'm not going to get into like the really, really boring details, or hopefully these won't seem like too boring details. But, there had started to bubble up some questions about this prayer book that we're using, and whether it's really adequate for what has become our current context, and also whether it's adequate for all of our contexts across the Episcopal Church, which, by the way, of course, are not all in the United States. And so there were lots of folks arguing for full-on prayer book revision, which would mean we'd have the whatever year new Book of Common Prayer. And they based this on a lot of arguments. One was the gendered language, to include more inclusive and expansive language for God and for humanity. Another was a lot of people talk about the lack of, again, not total lack of, but relative lack of talk about God's creation in the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. So there were folks who came up and testified and said, we really ought to be doing this in our prayers. It really ought to be more central. And then there were folks who asked that we have better translations in other languages. One of the ones that's talked about most is the Spanish Book of Common Prayer, the Spanish language Book of Common Prayer. I don't know if any of you have ever talked to a Spanish speaker about it, but I do not speak Spanish, but it is apparently not very good. In the translation, it's like a straight translation in a way. So what I'm told is it doesn't actually sort of capture the feel and the meaning of the prayers adequately. And it also doesn't sort of capture that poetic beauty of the prayers. And so that was another thing that really came up at General Convention that should be a priority. So it went back and forth. For those of you who don't know about General Convention, it's sort of the way that we do our business as a church. I actually think it's pretty cool because we've got a House of Bishops and they're fine, but much more exciting, we have a House of Deputies. And the House of Deputies is super cool because it's made up of clergy and laity. And the fact that our church has elected lay leaders playing an enormous role in things like prayer book revision or potential prayer book revision means a whole lot to me. That is like some heavy theological work, and it's done through our governance system by clergy and laity, and that means a whole lot to me. And so it went back and forth in the houses, and eventually what they came up with was this very odd resolution, which I won't throw up on here because I've been reading it now for like 2 years, and no one has really come to fully understand what it means. But here are the broad strokes. It asks to do something called memorialize the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. What does that mean? I'm on the committee. We're still not sure. We think it means that the 1979 Book of Common Prayer, no matter what, at least following this triennium, remains an authorized resource, and actually the primary authorized resource of the church. So it's not like the 1928 Book of Common Prayer, which is actually technically not an authorized resource anymore. So I think the point of that was to say, what we're not doing is throwing out this book, not right now. It asks for expansive language. And so we have done a lot of work in terms of what that means, expansive and inclusive language. And I want to tell you right now, that does not mean neutering God, which is what I hear quite often. I receive really colorful hate mail about that. I am not interested in God never being, in male pronouns never being applied to God. That is totally scriptural, and those metaphors are fantastic and they work. And there's a lot more to draw on. That's all. That's my point of view. And I have not actually heard anyone arguing for no gendered pronouns or imagery for God. If you find someone who's arguing for that, let me know, because I keep telling people that. So I want to be telling the truth. The resolution also asked for that understanding and appreciation for creation that I mentioned. It asked for the translation and put some money aside for it, which is great. So that is being worked on. It created this task force that I'm on to look at what all of this means. And it created what are called diocesan liturgical commissions. And what those are meant to do is to encourage parishes in the diocese to engage in this work of experimenting with liturgy and reporting back and saying how it works, and hopefully sharing. I will say we have not heard from the Diocese of California. So if anyone knows about a liturgical commission in California, do let me know, and I will update the website and move you all over to the column that has one and has a contact for it. Because you don't have a commission, if you did, I would tell you that you ought to be sending in all, I know you're doing such cool work with these midweek Eucharists and things like that. If you had a liturgical commission, I would say you should be sending those in to them, and then they would collect them and send them to us. Since you don't have one that I know of, please do send those along either to me directly, or you can send them to the email address of the task force, which is on the website. So this task force that I am on, Tiffelbubber, we broke down into subcommittees, and it ended up being one of those classic self-selection things where I, and I think every other member under 40, ended up on a communications committee, which we wanted to be on and had to argue for the value of, which I think was really interesting. And part of the reason for that was that we're all interested in what a Book of Common Prayer means. To John's point earlier, created before the internet, is it really a book? Going forward, thinking about it, is it really a book? And how does, if it is a book, which is fine, how does that work in sort of a forward thinking mode of what our liturgy looks like in our churches as sort of this paper stuff gets less and less common? Now, what we didn't know when we started thinking in these terms is that most of our bishops were going to be telling us right about now that when we do get back into our buildings, leaflets and books for a while, certainly books, and for some dioceses, leaflets are not going to be allowed. So all really interesting. We didn't know some of this would be so relevant so fast. So I'm going to talk about our subcommittee because I'm biased, and I think, and I'm really, really excited by our work, and I'm actually kind of proud of us because we got a lot of stuff done. The first thing we did was we built a website called episcopalcommonprayer.org, and I do commend it to you all. It's a simple website, and it does something simple, But what's really interesting is that it is a simple thing that has never been done before by the Episcopal Church. It has the draft documents of our committee. So if you want to look at what we're thinking in terms of what it means to say expansive and inclusive language, things like that, please, that's on the homepage. Look at those documents. They are really interesting and good work. It has a place to submit liturgies and submit ideas and opinions. So also please do that. It has a listing of diocesan liturgical commissions. So please do go on there and note your diocese. And my favorite page and my baby is the page for existing liturgical resources. There was not one web page with authorized liturgies for the Episcopal Church anywhere. It did not exist. The main Episcopal Church website had all kinds of liturgies here and there on different pages. Some of them are authorized, some of them are not, and some of them are unauthorized versions of authorized liturgies, so riddled with typos and just mistakes. So do not trust that website as a resource for your liturgies. It's really kind of sad. And one of the things, and it was actually like a lot of hard work to put together, because one of the hardest things to figure out beyond figuring out, okay, is this the actual text without the typos, and is this how it should actually be, was to figure out if liturgies were authorized and how they were authorized. So we have this, so, you know, what we knew was we had this 1979 Book of Common Prayer, and we knew that was authorized. Almost everyone gets that. We didn't know exactly about enriching our worship, which is something you all may have heard. When we say, hear what the Spirit is saying to God's people, anyone familiar with that? That's from Enriching Our Worship. It's a series of books with a bunch of liturgies. It's very commonly used in our churches. And there was no easy place to find how those are authorized. And in the last General Convention, there was actually like a pretty big change, which is that it used to be you had to ask your bishop to use liturgies from those books. And that is no longer the case. You can use something from EOW anytime. So to even say that on the website, to us, felt kind of powerful. And also to have, for the ones that do have PDFs available, free PDFs, that seemed really important too. Because one of the things that we started to realize is, okay, we've got the prayer book, we've got these books of enriching our worship, we've got these individual liturgies, like there was an expansive language liturgy that was authorized in the last General Convention. There are some liturgies for animals. There is something called Daily Prayer for All Seasons that are fully authorized for use in our churches, but people don't know about them. And so as far as I'm concerned, that is defeating that feel that we ought to have, that revolutionary feel that's so important to me about common prayer. It's making it so that we have these kind of secret liturgies that only people who went to seminary or who are really, really clued in, church nerds, know about. And so our subcommittee really wanted to change that. And so you'll see me, like, if you're on Facebook, I'm all over Facebook. Like whenever someone's like, I'm looking for this, I'm like, here, existing liturgies. Because to me, no matter whether we decide to revise the prayer book or whatever we authorize as a church, I think the most important thing is that it's accessible and easy to use for everyone. That's my own soapbox. I also think it's interesting because what we also kind of realized in putting it together is we have kind of built for ourselves a weird, almost like the Church of England's system of common prayer, where we have all these different liturgies that are authorized almost like the Book of Common Prayer, but we haven't really named that. And people are really uncomfortable with saying that. Yeah, is that common worship? Yeah. So again, if all we did as like, if all this committee accomplished was actually creating this webpage that presents in a fairly easy way what our authorized liturgies are and encourages the church to continue to do that, that will have been enough for me. But the other thing that it's revealed is that we haven't been very good about publishing those resources, and we certainly haven't been good at publishing them in either an affordable or free way. And so I think we need to think about that, and this reveals that. And we also have created a system where things are authorized, and if you really get into the weeds of our FAQ, things are authorized in all kinds of different ways. So it's super unclear how you go from, I have this idea for a really new liturgy that we really have to have responding to things like COVID-19 where we're all online. Like, it's really unclear how you get from there to, okay, this is now an authorized liturgy, which either is authorized at the level that you got to ask your bishop or just you can use. So again, for me, whatever we do, these are the three things that are important to me. And I would love to hear your thoughts about what's important to you in our liturgy in the Episcopal Church, is that revolutionary and empowering feel, a feel of the universal, and also a feel of the contextual. And I promise I'll stop talking after this and let you all talk. But the final thing that I wanted to say was, while I was at St. John's, Oakland, wonderful place that you are, I got to try out a liturgy that I wrote called the Paperless Eucharistic Prayer for the entire season of Lent. And you all went with it and were amazing. And I really can't believe you let me do that. It was so awesome. So that has been submitted to the subcommittee that is actually approving liturgies to go to General Convention, and it is going to General Convention. So that's very exciting. And St. John's Oakland is in the sort of accompanying note that it has been used and prayed. And I think one of the reasons for that is because, again, talk about like not thinking of a use for it. We're gonna all be in a situation where we can't have paper. So I definitely wish I could say that I anticipated that use. I did not, but I hope that and people who even think of more poetic and better ways to do paperless worship get through, so that we have some more options going forward. But I did want to thank you all for giving me that opportunity, and for always being a place that thinks about these things so openly. And so what I want to do now is hear about what's going on there with your new liturgies before I know things had to change, and what kind of things you're thinking about, and any other thoughts. And now I'll read your chat.
As I listen to you, I think about the I Confirm service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, that's an unauthorized, and yet we're selling it to other people.
Yeah, it's true.
I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah. I mean, technically, and again, part of this is diocesan culture. So like in this diocese in Vermont, we have a culture where if we were to use that liturgy, we would ask the bishop. It would just be an email, and she would just, I mean, I don't know her as well, but I've not known her not to write back pretty quickly and just say, yeah, that's great. So we have a culture, I think because it's such a small diocese, and also because it's a history with a bishop who's very into kind of liturgical innovation, of asking and getting permission. And actually then the bishop being like, so how'd that go? So that then, again, and this most of my experiences with our former bishop, Tom Ely, who would then say, oh, you know, that place down the road just did this might work for you. And that's the kind of culture that I'd like to see fostered in the church. Again, like not so much that you're asking the bishop or you're asking the commission because this is a scary thing, but because we want to work together and we want to know what works and what doesn't work. And we want to know what things are out there. Because again, yeah, some place across the country or across the diocese might be wanting to do the same thing. And might as well share instead of inventing the wheel 10,000 times.
I doubt we asked for permission, but I'd have to ask God.
I doubt you ask for permission too. That is, shall I say, I found that was not the culture in the Diocese of California.
I didn't get around to it.
I've heard that called the Jesuit method, to ask forgiveness rather than permission.
That's right.
Are we getting to that level?
Well, and I mean, another really important thing, and I've learned so much in this process of being on this committee, is that dioceses, I mean, I should have known this. I knew this in other ways, that dioceses are so different. So California and Vermont are very similar in other ways, right? Like culturally quite similar. There are dioceses that are incredibly restrictive. So one of the most controversial things we did on our website was actually to state clearly that enriching our worship, which is has slightly more equitable language, is authorized without asking the bishop. We had bishops get mad at us for making that so clear. And so they couldn't do anything about it because we have documentation that that's a thing that the House of Bishops voted for. But so that all of this stuff reads in really different ways in different places, and that actually I was actually one going into General Convention. I don't think we're going to have a full-on revision of the prayer book anytime soon, especially now with COVID. But I particularly came into the last General Convention being like, I don't really care about prayer book revision. Like it wasn't a top concern of mine. And I realize now that that's often the case for folks in dioceses like California and Vermont and Chicago, because they have either cultures or bishops who really support liturgical innovation and who are sensitive to communities that have contextual needs and need to adjust things accordingly. And so those places, if you're from one of these places, you're like, well, why are we going to go through all this trouble and all this pain when my Sunday mornings are okay, and when we need to do something, it's fine. Like, why would we spend all this energy and money and time in the church to do this? But then you'll talk to people who are lay leaders or priests in dioceses where the culture and the bishop are incredibly restrictive, to the point where, to say it is right to give God thanks and praise instead of it is right to give him thanks and praise is like a controversial thing. When you're sitting in a diocese like that, prayer book revision takes on a whole new meaning, and it's more urgent. Because what your bishop keeps saying is, it's not in the prayer book. It's not in the prayer book. It's not. And so, yeah, I would never have known that before this. And it's kind of counterintuitive, because what you realize is it's particularly a lot of lay leaders from the conservative diocese who want prayer book revisions because they're actually more progressive. But the folks in progressive dioceses are kind of like, we're fine because they've been doing what they need to do anyway. So that's a huge generalization, but it is a trend that I've noted.
So what about any hope of losing the Nicene Creed?
Losing the Nicene Creed? So that is one of those things that, no, there is no hope of losing the Nicene Creed. I can actually tell you that. It is one of those, you cannot touch it. You lose all credibility in an argument. I'm not defending it. It's sort of one of those, like, you can't touch it. No.
It's the third rail of the liturgy discussion.
What's that?
It's the third rail of the liturgy discussion.
It really kind of is. It really kind of is. And so, I have found myself doing it. Like, I will start sentences with like, I don't want to do anything to the creed. Like, because you can't get anywhere. You can't get anywhere.
Well, I'm very sorry to hear that. I have a child who swears she would come to church regularly if we lost it. So.
Well, there are churches in the Diocese of California that use an adjusted version from our friends, the Congregationalists, I think. So.
Do you happen to have any statistics on, because I think there's something about welcome and inclusiveness where people are shifting to paper bulletins. This is sort of the big argument. And when you have a paper bulletin, you are not so fixated on a prayer book per se. You might refer to it or pull it out occasionally, but there's a sort of a subtle groundwork there for toying with liturgies, because you can print them up and nobody's reviewing them, and you say, oh, that's whatever. And then you then the other side of that is that, you know, you can joke at St. John's by pulling the prayer book up and say, does anyone know what this is?
Right.
You know, so there, I don't know, have you thought about that tension?
We have, and in fact, we've thought of it even in the next stage, which is
People
what,
initially wanted this to welcome people.
yeah.
Pardon me?
We have thought about that, and we've even thought about it in terms of the next stage, which is, and again, this has been accelerated by COVID, is what happens when what people are looking at is this. And, you know, where it's like they get a link or something like that. And one of our secret, not so secret, we're going to present it to the rest of our committee, sort of long-term things for the further development of this website is the idea of kind of plug and play liturgy that would only allow you to plug and play things that are authorized. But yeah, I think that the fact that so many churches have not used the books themselves for years has probably created more of, again, sort of what we're talking about when we look at that web page, which is that, like, we actually do kind of have a culture where, as much as we think we have this one prayer book culture, that really hasn't existed probably for years. And we haven't noticed it because we haven't been using these. We've been using pieces of paper. So
I'm curious. Is the New Zealand prayer book officially
not authorized? Not authorized in the Episcopal Church. Now, again, a bishop can give, like, and some have, can give, it's not like they have to say to every church every time they want to use it, you can use it. Some bishops have given blanket permission for the use of the New Zealand prayer book. I have heard a bishop in a meeting use violent language to talk about how this person feels about Episcopal churches that use the New Zealand prayer book. So, yeah.
I do know when our son got married in Pennsylvania, the rector there, he thought long and hard about whether he could use some of that.
Yeah, yeah. It's really, so, and again, that's like the differences in culture. It's like, when I heard that, I was like, oh, like, I'm from Vermont. We use that, we use the New Zealand prayer book all the time. Like, so, but yeah, no, the liturgies from other parts of the Anglican Communion are not technically authorized resources in the Episcopal Church. But again, you can always ask, or you can just use them.
You have two questions from Anne. Is there a call out for liturgies? Is there some way to change gendered language without waiting for change to the prayer book?
Okay, second question I love. I love both questions. The first question is the call out for liturgies meaning, meaning is there a place to submit them? Is that what you mean? Yeah. So yes, we.
Do people know that the committee is actually, I mean,
yes, we've put out, yes, we have put out communications asking for them. What we would have liked, and some dioceses have been really good at this, like what we would have loved to see was each diocese, we knew this was unrealistic, but we would have loved to see each diocese set up a liturgical commission that did a whole lot of work and collected, you know, collected liturgies from across their diocese and then gave them back to us in a beautiful package, which some dioceses have done. But we recognize that that wasn't going to happen, and we don't want to penalize really good work in dioceses that just haven't gotten themselves together. So yes, if you have a liturgy or even an idea for the kinds of liturgies that ought to be developed, you can go on the website and there's a submission form, or there's a really easy email address, tflpbr@episcopalchurch.org. Oh, and then, oh yeah, my favorite. So my friend, Nikki Wood, and I, who was a seminary classmate of mine, actually wrote a resolution for General Convention, and it was a horrible failure. But it was that exact thing. It was saying, you know, we already do all these substitutions. And again, this was both of us coming from dioceses where that is common. So it is right to give God thanks and praise, kind of thing, or even using a she where there's a he. And so our whole argument was like, we're already doing this, like, can we just make it a thing that, you know, using the present prayer book liturgies, you may replace a pronoun for any God or divinity or humanity language. And it was really funny because when we put it together, we were told, this was actually from another committee I was on, and we were told by all the women on our committee, like, and we were the youngest people on it, they were like, no, like, it's not worth it. And we, we were like, oh, we feel so disillusioned and whatever. And we went forward with it. And yeah, it was a terrible failure and it did not pass. But thanks for the idea. It makes me feel better about putting it forward.
Was that in both houses, or?
It did not get, let's see. Yeah, it didn't really get out of committee because the committee that it was submitted to changed it so much as to be unrecognizable. I can't remember. I think whatever it became ended up passing, but it's like that whole part was gone. I can't even remember at this point what it actually became. I think it might have merged with another resolution.
I have a question for you, Kathleen.
Mm-hmm.
So is there room to be innovative, creative, and add liturgy after some sort of minimum use of the prayer book? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, we did all the stuff that we had to,
Mm-hmm.
and then we're going to supplement and allow the creativity to happen in some sort of either using the basics of the prayer book and then going beyond, or like, what's the kind of minimum? Or if we do an alternate service that's not, I don't know, Eucharist, for example, is that a place where we can innovate as opposed to, the main Sunday service? Or I don't know.
Yeah. No,
that was rambling. I'm sorry.
No, it wasn't rambling at all. It's a really good question, and you get a different answer depending on the diocese and parish you're in. The parish you're in, I'll just go ahead and say
we can do whatever.
You have a lot of room for innovation and a culture of innovation, right? And I also feel comfortable saying that what this General Convention resolution was about was to say, there ought to be some innovation. Now, it is true, it is generally harder to innovate on, you really hit on something. The principal Sunday service is harder to mess with than your midweek services, and particularly indeed midweek services that aren't Eucharists. And so that is one way that a lot of folks are doing a lot of innovative stuff. It's also a really interesting time because everyone's online now. And so it's like, again, even in dioceses with bishops who are really restrictive, it's kind of like, well, we got to figure something out. And obviously, some kind of innovation is going to need to happen in order for this to work on Zoom. So I think people are doing some interesting things that way. But I would say that liturgical innovation is being encouraged from the General Convention of the Episcopal Church because we really recognize, particularly in the areas of gendered language and creation care, some need. But I would say that the main things that I hear the committee looking at new authorized liturgies are looking for are areas where we don't have what we need. And so right now we've got all kinds of empty space there are so many liturgies to be written for online spaces, for socially distanced spaces, things like that. So yeah, I mean, not to silver lining it, but it is definitely a time for innovation that's calling for innovation.
One of the questions I have for you, Kathleen, that I've always been curious about, and I've noticed every diocese has a little bit different of a policy on this, and they certainly, there is the bare bones, sort of what the prayer book says, but then other people do different things. It would be great if there was clarification from a liturgy committee on, quote, deacons' masses.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, that's a bishop call. That's a bishop to bishop call. And bishops have really, really strong opinions on them. So for those who don't know, a deacon's mass is Eucharist where you use, I'm in a diocese that has never allowed them, so correct me if I'm wrong, where it's the reserved sacrament and a deacon sort of distributes. You can tell us, John, because
basically it's just reserved sacraments that have already been blessed from another service, and they're like when you have a lay Eucharistic visitor comes to visit the sick. I mean, it's no different, but it's distributed as a mass and technically you wouldn't use the word mass because it's already consecrated.
Mm-hmm.
But the service is led by the deacon because there's a priest absent.
Yep. Yeah, that's a bishop to bishop thing. But again, I will say that even in the most loosey-goosey diocese, my own included, bishops tend to have strong opinions on it. It's interesting. It's a big hot item here because I'm in a very small rural or diocese, and so we've got plenty of churches with no clergy or with a deacon and no priest, and so many churches would like to be authorized to do that. But the other side of our diocesan culture is that it's one with a really, really strong vocational diaconate. And so the feeling of the prior bishop, and it seems to be this bishop too, is, and again, I'm not saying I agree with it, it's just interesting, is that their feeling is that they don't want to confuse the specific vocation of a deacon. And they don't, my old bishop used to say, I don't want people to think that deacons are baby priests. They're their own as important thing, and it's a separate vocation.
Hey, Kathleen.
Hi, Ben.
I'm so curious if your task force is probably something that's beyond them, but I'm just, if you would share, have they had any conversation about the implications of a prayer book revision on other publications, particularly music? I, of course, am 100% behind a new prayer book. I don't want another enriching our worship. I think prayer book is the way, but that means we would need, hopefully soon after, a new hymnal, maybe 5 years like the last one, a new altar book, and what about all that music in the back of the altar book that we know doesn't exist anywhere else? And will we even care, actually, about setting some of this to chant and to, and maybe like new Glorias to the revised Gloria text, for example?
Yes. So yeah, it's really interesting how yet another lesson I have learned is how siloed those worlds are in our liturgical world, which maybe explains some things. We, as a committee, cannot and do not talk about music, except what I can report. I can answer the question of will people care, because we do receive emails about that, all that people care deeply. And I think, I don't know, we're all around this church enough. People care deeply about music, and I think that's also a thing being revealed right now because of the way people are mourning for the sort of loss of music and singing as we've known it. And so that would be up to the SCLM and it would be up to the convention. But yes, so it would go hand in hand. It would have to, exactly in the way you describe. But it is so fascinating to me that when you are talking about the prayer book, you are not talking about the music. It's so weird and telling.
So I have a question for Laura, who is
I know, Scott.
Services, and I'm curious about how all this is. I'm already feeling the wave of the East here. Like the East, the East versus the West, and having been ordained in the East, I'm not surprised by it, but the focus on using authorized materials and how the Saturday evening service has been kind of like anything goes, and we've tried to expand our mind and thoughts about how to be together, and it has had some effectiveness in being a place people feel more comfortable to invite folks. And so I don't know, I'm curious what Laura thinks about all this, because I've been on that team, and we haven't been able to do a Saturday night service for a while, and so we haven't been innovating in some ways, even though obviously Zoom in and of itself is an innovation in a sense. But we've had to shorten stuff because people have only so much tolerance. And so we've been leaving a lot of liturgy out. It's really a, it's a turbulent time.
It is.
Liturgically, actually.
I didn't realize we needed to get authority from our bishop. And I had looked at this website a while back. Scott had sent around the link. And so I had kind of backtracked with our Saturday evening services and documented all of our liturgy with the idea that we could submit it. So
please do.
I don't know if we should or not now.
No, that I do not want you to get that message. I've already submitted one from your parish. So
oh, really?
I mean, yeah, it's no, please don't. Please don't.
Well, don't forget, Laura, that we visited the Vine to get inspired. That's right in the heart of the cathedral. Yeah. And that is not a familiar liturgy.
Yeah, you're not sitting in a diocese no.
Yeah, there's a lot. I think there's a lot of different variations in the Diocese of California. I mean, you have St. Gregory of Nyssa. I mean, they're this Orthodox Jewish Anglican mixture.
They have their own deal too.
Their whole own deal with liturgical dance and all. Actually. And then you have right over here in Berkeley, St. Clement's that still uses the 1928 prayer book.
Right, which they do actually. They as far as I am aware, they do actually have a continuing authorization from the bishop for that, which is interesting. And again, I don't like the last thing in the world I wanted to do was at all discourage innovation, and also you sending it to me because I want to see it.
It's interesting to me that just over the centuries, the change is my understanding is the original Book of Common Prayer was because in some of the parishes, just strange stuff was going on. And that they wanted to make it uniform so that it really was scriptural, was sacred. And how we've now changed to the point now that, we want to allow more variation.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I've been thinking about a lot is how, because again, I get hate mail. And well, sometimes it's just to me, but sometimes it's to our whole committee. And there's a real fear that we're gonna lose what we love about this. Like there's a real fear that we're gonna lose that feel, that universal feel, that the shape, the tradition of it, the beauty of it. And I don't know what it is about me, but I don't share that fear. It's so a part of who we are. Maybe that's rosy. I just don't see us losing it. I really don't. And I think part of that is like maybe the history major in me that like we've made a whole lot of changes. And when you read the 1549, there are some major differences, but any Episcopalian in 2020 would actually like be able to find their way through this pretty comfortably.
Yeah, Cranmer did quite a job.
Right. Like I don't, and again, it's like, it hasn't, like there's this quality to it in Zambia. Like there's this, like I don't see us losing that. I don't see it as the concern that some people do. And I have nothing to back that up. It's just a feeling, which is why I think I'm a little bit more comfortable. And I also feel like part of the tradition itself is the innovation. Like that has been the history of it, of saying like, look, we've got these beautiful things. We have got these things we do right. Let's not mess with them. And like something in time and space has changed. And so let's make this adjustment and make it work and make it sing for now and for this place.
So Kathleen, I wonder if we should be sharing some of the liturgies from the Bishop's Ranch, which has
Yes.
Morning prayer and evening prayer that resemble nothing in any kind of a prayer book, and it's absolutely lovely.
Is there creation stuff in there?
And even oh yes, a lot more creation stuff. And when I was the prayer resident up there, I stopped reading the Bible, so it instead started reading Laudato Si, the Pope's. Yeah, and so that we studied creation for an entire month. I kept expecting to get fired. And one day, Pat Moore took me aside and she said, I have a suggestion to make for you. And that is when you come to the last line, read it twice. I mean, I really thought it was the end of my career there. But the chapel there is a chapel peculiar. It has no bishop.
Yeah, yeah.
So we have our liturgies.
That's really, I mean, again, like, and if it has the creation care, and then the other thing that we do, well, again, I'm not in the subcommittee, do not have the credentials to be in the subcommittee evaluating these liturgies, but I know that one of the things that they also look for is if they have been prayed, which is why St. John's did us all such a favor in allowing that Eucharistic prayer to be prayed, because it helps. So when you submit it, if you say, like, not only like, does this talk about the importance of God's creation in these liturgies, also they've been prayed over these years, I assume, and meant a lot to a lot of people. So that matters.
Susan, are those the Celtic liturgies, though?
Some of them are. Not the ones that I shared with your committee. They're a little different.
Okay.
Well, and then that's something to know too, like if there's a resource that you use that is not original, that like perhaps it's a prayer book from or something from somewhere else, I mean, that can be brought to the committee's attention as well. Probably this group knows about it already, but you never know. So if it's a published resource that's not an authorized resource of the Episcopal Church that you feel has value.
So we did have one that's used at Iona.
Oh yes, they are aware of Iona, which is great.
It felt like the strength of the Episcopal tradition are the seasons, and going through the seasons, but also it has always made me feel we could do a better job of rites of passage in the church, because I mean, certainly confirm, not conform is sort of emerges out of that change. You acknowledge a change that's going on, but I think there's so much more that could be done, like rites of passages around even retirement, which we just say, oh, good, you're retired. And it's not an easy process. And I've never found anyone say it's an easy process. And but there's so many other stages that we go through, I think, in life. And even the grief.
Yes.
I was going to ask you, we really, I would like to put together a service solely focused on grief right now, and kind of looking, I think there's all this hidden grief in all of us right now, and so sometimes it's not so hidden at all, but we're kind of a stiff upper lip kind of people, and we don't give the opportunity to put into words those deep feelings of anguish, and for other people, for ourselves, and it's across the board right now. I mean, we're grief around racism and injustice and healthcare, and grief of personal loss and people being alone, and kids not graduating. You name it, it's just everywhere. And is there a liturgy? Or a liturgy set or something that we could use as a resource for that?
Yeah, there is a book. I can't remember. It has like a really silly name. It's on the resources page. I can't remember. But there was a book that came out that is authorized, that's all transitions, but I've never gotten my hands on it. So I don't know how good it is or useful it is or what's in there. Has anyone seen that book? John? No? Yeah, you have. Any good? No. I had a feeling it wasn't because I've never encountered it. So that usually means that it's in the back of closets.
But we did have a parishioner at St. John's who, when her husband died, asked to be able to come up, and she wanted a special transition prayer for entering the chapter of widowhood.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, yeah, it was very special.
I think that's one thing to remember as well, that, I mean, we're getting a lot of submissions of prayers, which are great. I'm not sure they're going to go anywhere because we actually already do have that freedom, right? We can write a collect, we can write a prayer, we can write a litany, things like that. And prayers of the people, which we oft forget, follow an order, but we can write a prayers of the people. And so we have that opportunity for innovation most any week. And so, which, you know, isn't a whole liturgy, but is a prayer. Yeah, and Episcopalians, well, I have always found in congregations I've been a part of, it's like we've got our people for whom prayer is a gift, like the either extemporaneous or written prayer. But on the whole, usually most Episcopalians aren't necessarily that practiced or comfortable at coming up with their own prayers. So that would be a fun thing to encourage.
I think in the Eucharist and in the liturgies, what people are really missing right now is the kinetic part of it. You know, the standing up, the sitting down. And when the youth and I were talking about it last week, you know, many of them would say, oh, I don't take communion, I don't care. And yet they talk about so many things that happen in the service that they miss. You know, they said, who thought we'd miss kneeling and standing, you know? But, you know, one of the things they want to do is they really want to talk about the grief of the unknown, of what's around the corner, right? And so we've been talking about doing that. And they're big to putting things into fire pits, right? Like writing it down and putting it into fire pits. And I said, why is that so important to you to have that? And their concept was using all the sensories, you know, using the touch and the smell and the, you know, they're not tasting it, thank God. But, you know, those senses are what we're all missing, you know.
Turns out they matter. And if that's a weird takeaway of this all, that, yeah, the taste and the touch and the smell and all of that mattered all this time. And we knew it did, but I knew it did, but not as much as I do now.
It's certainly less boring than the old Baptist service where you can just, you know, you get up a couple of times to sing hymns, but the rest of it, you're spectator.
Hey, Kathleen, I have one more question.
Yeah.
What time is it in Vermont?
9:39 p.m. I had some coffee.
Bring two, Ben.
I gotta go.
Thanks.
Well, I do want to thank you all, and I do mean it. It's so good to see these faces, and I really mean it. Laura, you don't have to submit it officially if you don't want, but I would love to see what y'all are doing, or what you were doing at the very least before Zoom time. So.
Well, yeah, you were part of it. You got us going.
So when is the next? Is there going to be a kind of a place and a time where there might be some real evolution in that conversation at the national level?
I mean, the idea.
Can we get a report back at some point about what's been happening? And
well, so my committee has been putting out some reports. Obviously, we're, you know, probably, well, I don't know. I'm kind of impressed that we've continued to do our work. So you can see our updates on the website. But yeah, I mean, I think the real time that we'll know sort of where we're headed is the next general convention. Again, I will tell you, I do not think we're headed for prayer book revision. I already didn't think that, and now I really don't think that, because the church is going to be focusing on other things. That does not mean that it's not going to focus on innovation, I believe now more than I did before that it is going to focus on innovation because there are so many more reasons to innovate. Like there is a necessity to innovate, to have rights for things we never could have imagined 3 years ago. So, so I think that, so again, I mean, this is just, I don't know the answer, but I think at the General Convention, the big question will be like, does the Task Force on Liturgical and Prayer Book Revision get renewed? Does it continue to be a thing for 3 more years? I don't know. Our big concern in my subcommittee is what happens to our website. Does it go to 815 to the church office where they forget about it and don't maintain it? Does General Convention put a little money aside for somebody to deal with it? We're like, we'll do it. Does it go to the SCLM? Is there anyone on the SCLM who can handle that? Does it go to the, what's the name of the title? The prayer book custodian? We were like, it could be the new job of a digital prayer book custodian. There are all kinds of different ways of thinking of it. But yeah, so I think the next General Convention which is going to be an interesting one, is where we'll kind of see where we're headed. But my best guess is we are not headed to a prayer book revision, but we are headed to a time where it is clear that there is need for continuing liturgical innovation.
What's your website again?
It is episcopalcommonprayer.org.
Okay, thank you.
Kathleen, thank you so much for the work you're doing. I mean, I realize how much patience I no longer have for getting diverse groups, liturgical groups together to agree on something. And yet that holds the whole communion together, some commonality, while also allowing for some creativity. I'm so pleased to hear that your Eucharistic prayer is making it all the way to General Convention. That's huge. That's huge. So
I mean, you know, we'll see what happens to it, but
I always remember what Bill Swing said about I always talk about this with the confirmation class, that when the URI, United Religions Initiative, they spent 3 years coming to an agreement on one sentence in their creed. 3 years of conversation. And so, you know, there's that tension between, wow, where's the creativity, but there's also the very conversation of what we believe and how we welcome people or innovate is all part of connecting us all in some way. It's a hard tension to hold. So thanks for being in the middle of it.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Kathleen. It's great to see you.
Thank you so much.
Lovely to
Bye,
see you.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
It's you and me again. Yeah.